and recording. And welcome Ben here this evening for a special Ray Cultural Center presentation. Thank you, Ben, so much for being here. And thank you to all of your students and participants. It's really nice to see so many folks here this evening. I will let Ben begin and honoring this day with this special presentation. So, thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you everyone who's here joining. Real quick, I'll just introduce myself to those who might not know me. My name is Benjamin Becote. I'm a teacher at the Waterville Valley Academy. I teach humanities, history, and English, and I've been working there for 17 years. It's been an awesome trip, and I get to work with some awesome people, and I'm really glad to see you guys here today, and then some others who are just here at Waterville locals or here from outside, wherever you came from. Thank you for spending this next hour with me tonight. I'm gonna jump into this thing, but before I get started, I'd like to ask everyone to just join me in a moment of silence. I want to have a moment of silence for all of the people and all the lives and innocence that we lost on January 6th. So join me just for a second in a moment of silence. All right, thank you very much. To tell the story of African American history, it requires some fortitude. The trauma and the terrors of the past, they still supersede the successes of the present. As Americans together, collectively, we must grapple with the weight of history in order to face the future. As said, history bears repeating. The world moves not like an arrow, but a boomerang. Beware of those who speak of the spiral of history. They are preparing a boomerang. I know. I have been boomeranged across my head so much that I now can see darkness and lightness. Ralph Ellison, The Invisible Man. January 6th was a boomerang across my head, and I don't know if I've recovered yet. My steel helmet wasn't enough, and I bet that I'm not the only one reeling, seeing history repeat. As Americans, we're not used to protest. Protest is part of America's history. We were birthed by protest, rebellion, and civil disobedience, all in the name of freedom. In fact, our democracy requires protest. We're a diverse group of over 330 million souls, and our promise of pursuit of happiness, our promise of life and liberty, requires each of us to try, to think, to contribute, to make our Constitution come alive. Over last summer, America protested in numbers never seen before. Estimates range from 15 to 26 million people protested in some way after the killing of George Floyd. My math's a little sketchy, but that's about 10%. So think about your neighbors and your friends, and you can count 10 people. One of them protested. As a patchwork of overlapping concerns, experiences, and desires, what America is depends on you and it depends on me. Our understandings of ourselves, our understandings of each other is what fosters our ability to have community, to prosper, to create. What innovations we have today, they have come from the collaboration of diverse thoughts, the collaboration of diverse people, and diverse approaches. Civil rights and Martin Luther King's Jr. Day is a celebration of the individual that contributes to bettering their society. Today, I want to celebrate those who have bettered America. I want to tell you a few of their stories. This is a story about honor and about resistance, about overcoming, about dedication. Some of these quotes up here are helpful to give you some kind of background to think about what our founders were thinking or what this speech is going to help us talk about tonight. But before I get into the serious stuff, here's a joke. The Three Amigos it's a really cheesy comedy, and it was written in the 80s, and Steve Martin is this like terrible cowboy, Lucky Day, and he's got a couple of hands there with him, some salty dogs like Ned Netherland and Dusty Bottoms. They're pretty ridiculous, and their hijinks are crazy, but they're quoted illustrating the ethos of a civil rights leader. Wherever there is injustice, you'll find us. Wherever there is suffering, we'll be there. Wherever liberty is threatened, you'll find us. Likewise, civil rights leaders have always stepped up to the call. Each series has an epic event or a series of events that are marked by characteristics. The history of enslaved people in America has always been a history of resistance. Quaker societies established in the 17th century in Pennsylvania were allies to the enslaved. Ardently abolitionists, they recruited and they spread their message, they spread their consciousness. The Quakers were woke before woke. Their resistance to slavery inspired the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who Abraham Lincoln would later credit for the epic of his time, the Civil War. She helped shape the 13th Amendment and the Gettysburg Address. Innovation is part of human nature. Whenever faced with a problem or a problematic institution, it's encoded in our DNA to find a solution. The present asks us to innovate. The past is littered with examples of innovation to learn from. Whether that innovation comes from a mentality or from a novel application, each innovative act has served as a collective bonus, signaling our virtues and our capacities. Innovation is contagious and it's worth catching. Really good ideas are like babies. They require gestation, a suitable host environment, nurturing, and love. Love can foster life. Love can also fuel death. The successes of the past have also involved trauma. Collectively, Americans are involved in the psychic struggle. Today, the realities of living together in our democracy requires representation. Each member of us deserves to have their self respected. They deserve to have their self respected. They deserve to have their property. In America, it's no longer acceptable in the defense of property or in the acquiring of property for one to interfere with the progress of another. Our history has been highlighted by those who have worked to uplift others. Our history has been blighted by those who have oppressed others. Here's some examples of some innovation. Obviously, the horrors of slavery are well documented, and I don't want to spend your time refreshing them, but I will hit on some of the successes. These two are one of the successes, and one of the ways in which they can show the power of love. They innovated in ways to escape the current conditions that they lived through. And through their innovations, they found the freedom they so rightly deserved. There's a term called hegemony, and it's defined as the dominance of one group over others. Hegemony can also function in our thinking. While in of itself, hegemony is not a bad thing. As we tend to gravitate towards people or group, towards things that we can identify with, a sense of belonging is an innate drive in humans. We make communities. We find commonalities. Our communities can be inclusive or seclusive groups of identities. Our democracy is bettered by the inclusive communities who can innovate. These inclusive communities are where progress results best. Humanity is bettered by acts in the service of others. Malcolm X is credited with the quote, If you stick a knife 9 inches in my back and pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wound that the blow made. They haven't pulled the knife out. They won't even admit that it's there. What is a union of suffering wounded? How can we neglect our neighbors if we can see them suffering? Sadly, it's pretty easy. Yet, despite incredible odds, humanity has persisted. Culture is dynamic. It responds to charismatic leaders, and our culture reflects our society's values, our society's desires, and our fears. Fear is an emotional equivalent to the Staples easy button. Bing, done. Fear makes us move. As children, we're first taught to fear, for good reasons. The stove is hot. It'll burn you. But too often, we're taught for bad reasons. Past epochs have illustrated how fear has shaped people and characterized localities. However, creativity and innovation are rarely fostered among these groups. Fear functions as a throttle, stifling those who feel it. Where freedom and innovation thrive, there people will follow. If you build it, they will come. Hashtag filled dreams. Hashtag I have a dream. Hashtag suffrage. Stepping up to serve the needs of the greater good is one way to honor and appreciate the fact that you're just alive. Both in the past and the present, they serve to illustrate this. Across religions, political views, and ethnicities, we celebrate those who sacrifice self and bring rewards to benefit their community. English literature began ostensibly with the story of Beowulf. He is a great hero who lived and died enriching his village. Beowulf's story ends tragically with his death and enemy that his village gates, but in remembrance, in telling and retelling his story, his legacy endures. Because of the contributions of many individuals defining and redefining service and sacrifice, each generation has an example of a heroic deed, person, or ambition. There might be a hero listening among us. Look, it should only be in literature, movies, and cartoon where the hero has to die to be heroic. The personal pursuits of one's best is inspirational. Individual feats serve to uplift humanity's imagination. They serve to expand our possibilities. One man might break the fastest mile, but together, Americans put a rover on Mars. Look, as our pandemic rages in our present time, pandemics were also not new to our country. Pandemics have been here like racism and have spread throughout our country. One early pandemic that we faced and faced down successfully was faced down with the help of unlikely friends, unlikely allies. I'm talking about smallpox. Let me get there real quick and I'll come back. Sometimes, as we look at this pandemic and the rages, smallpox, it was cured in a pandemic through inoculation. Inoculation was a technique that was brought to the Americas from Africa and Asia. It was a technique that the slaves did and knew to keep themselves from being infected. Most of Americans were afraid to try something that the slaves would do. And it wasn't until the end of the War of Independence in the Battle of Boston, when George Washington quartered his troops in Boston, and before the battle, forced everyone to inoculate, forced everyone to quarantine. His gamble paid off, and they won the Battle of Boston. This wouldn't have happened without Cotton Mather and without his slave. Let me go back and I'll come forward. As we celebrate civil rights leaders, we can witness the past, and my hopes for this speech are to spur us to march for better in ourselves. Martin Luther Jr. said, Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? As Americans, we're taught to be individuals and to search for our individual pursuits and our individual greats. And then we live in a country where individuality is treasured. It's also dangerous. If we neglect our neighbors, if we neglect to look around at our friends, if we neglect to see that they have those same ideals and ambitions that we share and we hope, it's a lot easier for us to repeat the mistakes of the past. Each of us have a hero in us, and we have the beginnings of that hero journey that's being asked of us today. Today, we're being asked to look at our life in unusual ways. We can reflect on the individuals that are special in our lives and the ones that are special in our community, but we also have to allow space for outsiders to come into our community. These outsiders have brought advantages to our communities and have helped spread and foster innovations. The civil rights leaders in today's celebration recognizes the common and the uncommon contributions of the many lives who were bettered by bettering their community. These soldiers who served in World War I and in World War II served in segregated units. They were often in the worst conditions with few resources, yet they served willingly. They came back to a country that was racist. They came back to a country that hated them, but they served and fought for that country and fought for the ideals that country represented. The Negro Leagues was just recently honored, and all of the players who played in the Negro Leagues, they played separately from their white counterparts, knowing the whole time that they were equal to their white counterparts. And now in 2020, their stats will be 2021 rather, their stats will be elevated to be the same as their counterparts. We'll see the new home runs in a season change, the new home run leaders in a season, the new hits in a season. All of these numbers and all of these contributions to Major League Baseball, to our sports, to our entertainment have caused us collectively to think bigger, to think better, to work harder, to try more, to become a better athlete, or to become a better teammate, or to become a better manager, or even a better fan, to look and to get to know and understand ourselves. Sometimes fate brings us together in unusual ways. Edison understood that his role was to make sure that Lewis Lattimore received the recognition that he so rightly deserved. Lewis Lattimore worked alongside Edison, and the two of them recognized that same spark in each other, that same spark and desire to innovate, that same spark that saw a problem and couldn't rest until they found a solution. You don't have to create a light bulb to innovate. You don't have to create the light bulb to change the world. But if you recognize that spark in somebody else and help uplift them, you never know what they might be able to accomplish. Sometimes we're weird pairs. Malcolm X and Red Fox. Your parents would probably know Sanford and Son. But the stars of Sanford and Son would later say of Malcolm X that he was the funniest man alive and the only man that he could trust. These unlikely pair would start as dishwashers together and become best friends immediately. They'd come up through Harlem together. Malcolm would later go into jail. Malcolm would later become the revolutionary figure that he is today. Malcolm would later be assassinated. Red Fox would later go on to have a career in comedy and speak to sold out arenas, encouraging people to see not only his art, but to see his culture and to see his people reflected in what he was able to do. Our cross-cultural exchanges and our communities are bettered as we work together, as we work to lift each other up. And as we look across history, we can find all, all sorts of examples of caring of people who have worked to common good, to common benefit. Ultimately, civil rights is concerned with power dynamics. Civil rights leaders are characterized by speaking truth to power. The time and place of that speaking might be irrelevant. Muhammad Ali spoke with his fists mostly, but he also liked to trash talk. He spoke loudly inside the ring and he talked trash outside the ring. He captivated millions of people with his athleticism and with his willingness to just be bold. He even went to jail for his stance against Vietnam. But many years later, when he saw a veteran hurting, he didn't see the veteran as the man who fought in Vietnam, who had fought for the cause that he went to jail against. He saw the veteran as a man who was hurting. Muhammad Ali met this man just because he heard about it on the radio as he was driving around town. And he went to the building, talked the man off the ledge. Joe would say, Muhammad Ali saved his life that day. Muhammad Ali would say that Joe saved him that day. It's easy for us sometimes to see our elected leaders or our civil leaders as heroic, as larger than life individuals. It's easy to be complacent and let somebody else do it for us. However, there comes a time when silence is violence. Evil doesn't have to be an overt act. It can merely be the absence of good. And there have been 11, now 12, Black Americans elected to Senate. And these elected members are a new generation and have inspired a new generation to run for history and higher office. Each election serves to show us our nation's values and to reflect to us our nation's concerns. Voting is our individual citizens' most sacred right. America seems to be on a threshold where we reached a nexus, where civil norms have been threatened, where traditions have been trampled on, and even as a disease rages across our country, the discourse across cultures have been threatened. They are actively being discouraged. As an American dies every 30 seconds due to the mishandling of this pandemic, dually, we must courageously face two traumas. We face the threat of extremism, and we face the threat of this pandemic. Officer Eugene Goodman, he faced a mob outnumbered. That's him in the center and him on the right. He's recognized the man who saved the Senate from insurrectionists. Without concern for himself, he simply did his job. The highly unusual circumstances of him doing his job make it seem heroic. But he just did his responsibility. If we look at him as an example, and if we simply just do our job, if we do our responsibility to not be silent in the face of evil, to stand up, especially if we're going to stand up in the face of others or help support others, when we do that, we are honoring the legacy of Martin Luther King. We are honoring the civil rights journey. We're being our own little heroes. Look, America is only good as we who live here make it. January 6th saw our latest, scariest intersections of race and politics play out. Race, politics, race and power, race, gender, and representation, these are all just constructs. They're categories, like blank pages, just to be written on. Like our Constitution, these categories are in of themselves just letters and sounds linked together. You define these things, we define these terms by actively advancing their definitions. They can be characterized according to your individual truth. However, to each and to etch your truth onto these, you must act. It is up to you and your community to shape what these things are. It is up to you and your community, and it's up to all of us together to shape what our Constitution is. If we're looking up at my page, it's only going to be as good as we here make it. Martin Luther King Jr. is someone that we celebrate today, but as I was telling my history students, he wasn't a perfect man. The night before he was killed, he was having an affair with his wife, with someone different than his wife. The day he was killed, he was stepping out on the balcony to have a cigarette. Normal, everyday people do extraordinary things. You don't have to be extraordinary to be a hero. You don't have to invent the light bulb. You don't have to stand up to a mob. You don't have to entertain millions. You don't have to run for higher office. You just have to step up and do so to help someone else. In a few minutes, I'll try to take some questions, but I wanted to conclude by talking a little bit about intersectionality. Because the intersections that we saw of race and politics play out on January 6th was an ugly example. There have been some beautiful examples of intersection playing out in a positive way in America over the summer. One of which are in entertainment. When you think about in sports, we saw Black Lives Matter painted on Fenway. You saw Black Lives Matters on NASCAR, on Formula One, on WNBA, on the NBA games. You saw Black Lives Matters before every start of the Premier League championship seasons. You saw players, athletes, you saw coaches take a knee. You saw politicians make a stand. You saw people protest. Whether it was your neighbors handing out signs, whether it was your parents supporting a cause, whether it was something you did yourself. In some way, we saw many examples of people going out of their ways to look out for their neighbors, help stand up for other ones, and they saw evil happening, when they saw things that weren't right or unjust were happening. And it's up to us as individuals to stand up to unjustness anywhere so that we can make that better America that we deserve, the better America for our children that they deserve, the better America that Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed about with his dream. And we can honor that legacy for the people that come after us. Thank you guys for your time. This is my speech. I kind of ran through it fast, but I'm going to look through the chat and see if I can get to any of your questions that you brought up. And again, thank you so much for your attention today. And thank you for going out tomorrow to make a better world.
Thank you so much, Ben. And as Ben mentioned, there are a lot of folks on the call tonight. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat and we'll do our best to get to some of them. And we can probably take a voice question or two as folks are in there, but I have 4 screens to look through. So I'm right now I'm getting some thank yous in our chat. So it's great to have a perspective just to remind us, you know, that there is so much tough times out there, and having a great interaction with a person and paying attention to what is right and what feels good. Most of us know.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate everyone being out. I'm looking through the chat right now, and so far I don't see too many questions. So I'm gonna assume that if you have questions, you can send them to me at school. You can catch me email, or some of you guys have my personal numbers or whatever. So feel free to follow up. To all of my U.S. history students, make sure that you were taking notes. There's gonna be a quiz tomorrow. Just kidding. And then to everybody else, who's on the call. I just, like I said, this talk is just to encourage all of us to step up and do that little bits that we can in our own little communities, because that's how we can honor this day. That's how we celebrate civil rights. That's how we make our America what it can be. So thank you guys again for being here.
Thank you so much. It's much appreciated, and we're so glad that we could join together with you and with the Academy and the Ray Center in town and reach out to so many folks this evening. So again, send any questions directly to Ben or to myself. Tonight's presentation will be recorded and available on our website, and I will make sure that Ben has that link as well. And again, thanks so much for your time and being.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.